We've got the car, and he's then gone to Bugatti and gone, the lads have bought the car, I need to get this part, this part, this part. Porsche side or Bugatti side have said, absolutely no chance, we can't give you the part.
There is a moment in every David versus Goliath story where you stop and ask yourself how he even got here. How did a mechanic from the English Midlands, a guy who learned to change brake pads in his father's workshop and once spent his teenage years flying off ramps on a BMX bike, end up becoming the single most uncomfortable presence for one of the most powerful and prestigious car manufacturers on the planet? How did Bugatti, a brand that has spent over a century building an aura of untouchable exclusivity, find itself on the defensive against a YouTuber with a socket set and a ring light? The answer is not simple, and it is not really about one crashed car. It is about something much bigger than a wrecked Chiron sitting in a Miami garage. It is about power, control, brand mystique, and what happens when the internet decides it wants to watch the curtain get pulled back on all of it. Bugatti is not scared of Mat Armstrong because he is rebuilding their cars. They are scared because he is winning the audience while doing it, and that is a problem no corporate statement can fully solve. Let us start from the beginning and walk through exactly how this story unfolded, why it matters far beyond the automotive world, and what it actually reveals about the fragile architecture of ultra-luxury branding in the age of YouTube. Before you can understand why Bugatti is rattled, you need to understand who Mat Armstrong actually is, because on paper, he should not be a threat to anyone. He was born in Leicester, England, grew up around tools and oil and the sound of engines, and spent his formative years learning the trade from his father, who ran a garage and made his living working on everyday vehicles. That upbringing gave Armstrong something that cannot be taught in a classroom. It gave him an instinct for mechanical problems, a comfort with getting his hands dirty, and a complete absence of the reverence that most people feel when they stand in front of $1 million machine. Before cars became his identity, Armstrong was a competitive BMX rider. He was good enough to represent himself internationally, travel to events across Europe and beyond, and earn sponsorship from serious names in the sport. His career came to an abrupt end when a shoulder injury sustained during a major international competition refused to heal properly and kept recurring until competitive riding was no longer viable. It was the kind of setback that redirects a life, and in his case, it redirected him toward a camera and an editing suite. He launched his YouTube channel in April 2013, initially posting BMX content, the kind of videos that a young athlete makes when the sport is still the whole world. The pivot toward cars happened gradually, and then all at once. The defining moment came when his girlfriend's Audi TT was damaged in a crash. Instead of sending it to a body shop and moving on, Armstrong bought the wreck, tore it apart, rebuilt it piece by piece, and documented the entire process on camera. Something about that format connected with viewers immediately. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone face a broken thing and refuse to accept that it was beyond saving. From that point, the channel grew with purpose. A Bentley Continental GT rebuild during the pandemic years brought in a wave of new viewers and his first meaningful sponsorship, when Richard Hammond, a name synonymous with automotive entertainment at the highest level, reacted publicly to one of his videos. A new wave of subscribers arrived overnight. Armstrong went full-time around late 2019, and from there, the trajectory was relentless. The projects moved upmarket with every passing year. Maseratis, Porsches, Lamborghinis, Ferraris. By 2026, the main channel had crossed 6 million subscribers. Individual videos were pulling in millions of views, and total views across his content had surpassed 900 million. He also runs a second channel that itself sits close to 3 million subscribers. One other detail matters here. Armstrong has a Bugatti logo tattooed on his leg. That is not a piece of trivia. That is a statement about how much this brand occupied his imagination long before he ever stood next to one of their cars with a torque wrench in his hand. For him, Bugatti was never just a manufacturer. It was a symbol of the absolute summit of automotive achievement, The thing that a kid working in his dad's garage dreams about when he looks past the Fords and Vauxhalls lined up outside. That detail makes everything that followed feel less like a business conflict and more like a personal reckoning. The story that brought Armstrong into direct conflict with Bugatti began in October 2025 when he learned about a crashed Bugatti Chiron per Sport sitting in Miami. Any reasonable person scrolling past that listing would have kept scrolling. Armstrong booked a flight. The car in question was one of only 60 ever produced. The Chiron Pure Sport was a handling-focused variant built for drivers who wanted the absolute outer edge of what the platform could deliver. It had stiffer suspension, revised gear ratios, a higher engine redline, reduced weight, and a starting price of €3 million. On the open market, cars in good condition were trading hands for somewhere between $4 and $6 million. This one had been in a serious collision. The front structure had absorbed a heavy impact. Airbags had fired. Carbon fiber panels were fractured. The signature horseshoe grille was destroyed. When Armstrong arrived in Miami and stood next to it in person, the damage was even more confronting than the photographs had suggested. The car belonged to an American content creator named Alex Gonzalez, known online as FexLXG. Bugatti had sent a technician from France to assess it, and that technician had declared it a total loss. What happened next was the moment this story stopped being about one damaged car and started being about something else entirely. Bugatti locked the car's VIN number. That action meant no authorized Bugatti dealer anywhere in the world could supply replacement parts for it. The only officially approved path to repair was to ship the car to the factory in Molsheim, France, at a cost that was quoted at approximately $1.7 million. When Gonzalez declined, Bugatti reduced the estimate, but he turned that down as well. His concern was that once the car entered the factory, the repair scope would expand with every inspection, each new problem adding to a bill that had no ceiling he could control. It was a reasonable fear, and it kept him from taking the official route. What Gonzalez did next was the kind of thing that only works in the social media era. He took to his platforms and issued Bugatti a public ultimatum: allow parts to be sold for the car within 24 hours, or he would manufacture every component himself using 3D printing. Most companies receive that kind of post, note it internally, and never respond publicly. Bugatti CEO Mat Armstrong responded within the deadline, sending a direct message that opened with a confirmation of who he was, before explaining why 3D printing structural components on a car of this complexity was not a safe path forward. The gearbox housing had shattered. The carbon fiber monocoque had taken damage that went beyond cosmetic. These were not problems a desktop printer could solve. With the parts blacklist remaining in place and no official support available, Gonzalez brought Armstrong in to attempt a private rebuild. What had begun as a salvage situation was now one of the most watched automotive projects in the world. When Armstrong began stripping the Chiron and documenting his findings, something happened that Bugatti had no mechanism to prevent. The audience arrived in enormous numbers, and they stayed. A single video focused on the cost of replacement parts gathered nearly 7 million views within its first 4 days. The figures Armstrong was citing were extraordinary. Headlights quoted at around $58,000 each. The horseshoe grille surround approaching $93,000. Individual carbon fiber fenders estimated at roughly $200,000. The transmission, if it required a full replacement, pushing past $185,000. And none of those figures included labor, structural work, or the process of splitting the car to access the damage to the monocoque. For Bugatti's PR operation, this was a nightmare playing out in slow motion, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Every video Armstrong posted was another lesson for millions of people who had never previously given a thought to how a hypercar gets put back together. The brand that had spent decades cultivating an image of serene, unquestioned perfection was watching a man in a workshop pull its most exclusive product apart piece by piece and show the details to the internet. Rimac eventually stepped into the public conversation through a video posted on Instagram. He acknowledged Armstrong directly, said he had followed his work, and respected him as a creator, and then drew a clear line on behalf of the company. The position Bugatti was taking was not purely about corporate policy. There were genuine engineering concerns behind it. The Chiron is built around a carbon fiber monocoque that is not simply a structural shell. It is the foundation from which everything else in the car derives its integrity. When that structure sustains damage in a collision, the implications are not always visible to the eye. Rimac noted that only a very small number of people in the world possess the specific training required to safely separate the rear subframe from the monocoque, and that performing that procedure incorrectly carried serious safety consequences. The gearbox mount which Armstrong's team discovered had not suffered a hairline fracture as initially thought, but 2 significant tears, was an engineered failure point. It was designed deliberately to break in a crash so that impact forces were redirected through the structure rather than through the occupant cell. A specialist on the rebuild team welded it back together using TIG welding, a repair that drew criticism from engineers who understood why that component was designed to fail in the first place. Rimac also used the moment to address what he described as inaccurate cost figures circulating in Armstrong's videos and across social media. He clarified that the real figures were high, but not as extreme as some claims suggested, and he explained the economics behind them. Developing and certifying components for a car produced in numbers as small as 500 requires enormous upfront investment in research, testing, and regulatory approval. When that investment is divided across such a limited production run, the cost per part reflects genuine development expenditure, not arbitrary pricing designed to exclude people. But underneath the technical and economic arguments, Bugatti's real discomfort ran deeper. In the world of ultra-exclusive collector cars, provenance is not a soft concern, it is a financial reality. A Chiron per sport with a rebuild history involving non-certified parts, fabricated components, improvised solutions, and no factory documentation does not just carry uncertainty, it carries a permanent discount. Buyers in that market want cars that can be traced back through an unbroken chain of authorized service records. A car that appeared in a series of viral YouTube videos while being rebuilt in a Florida garage, however skillfully, is a car that will always carry a question mark above its head at auction. While the Chiron rebuild was still unfolding and commanding global attention, Armstrong was approached about a Bugatti Veyron that had ended up with a repossession company. The Veyron was built originally for the Dubai market. It came with no documentation, no service history, and no explanation for its condition. Armstrong bought it on impulse because that appears to be how he operates, and started filming immediately. The Veyron is not a footnote car. Only 450 were ever produced. Values sit above £1.5 million. The example Armstrong acquired was externally presentable. The engine would start, but the car refused to drive. Specialists had quoted as high as £350,000 for a full gearbox replacement. When Armstrong began investigating the fault methodically, he found something that has since become one of the most talked about moments of his entire career. The gearbox faults were caused by a blown fuse. He drove to a mainstream automotive parts retailer, purchased a fuse for a negligible sum, installed it, and the faults cleared entirely. A potential 6-figure repair bill, the kind that would send most owners directly to the nearest authorized service center, was resolved with a component that costs less than a cup of coffee. The moment was not just entertaining television, it was a statement. It demonstrated that not every problem with a complex, ultra-exclusive machine requires the manufacturer's intervention. It showed that diagnostic information, careful reasoning, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious can sometimes solve problems that specialist quotes suggest are catastrophic. But the Veyron project also delivered a more significant reveal. When Armstrong contacted Bugatti to inquire about sourcing replacement parts for the rebuild, the answer he received was identical to the one he had received during the Chiron project. Parts would not be supplied to anyone working outside the authorized service network. The car would need to be taken to an official facility for any factory components to be made available. This was the moment the story changed in a fundamental way. The parts blacklist on the Chiron had been easy to interpret as a specific reaction to a specific situation. A crashed car, a viral conflict, a public dispute between an owner and the manufacturer. Perhaps the policy in that case was driven by the drama, by the public nature of the disagreement, by Bugatti wanting to protect its interests in a fight that had already gone far further than anyone anticipated. The Veyron response destroyed that interpretation completely. The policy was not reactive, it was structural. Bugatti had a written position on its official website, stating that all work on their vehicles must be carried out by an authorized service partner. This was not a punishment for Gonzalez or a response to Armstrong's videos. It was the standard operating position of the brand, applied equally to any car, any owner, and any situation that fell outside their network. Armstrong now owned 2 Bugattis simultaneously and had been refused parts for both of them. For his audience, which had been following both stories in parallel, the implication landed clearly. This was not about one dispute, this was about a systematic restriction that applied across the entire marque, and which effectively made independent ownership of a Bugatti, in any meaningful sense, extremely difficult. The surface story here is about car parts and repair policies, and whether a YouTuber should be allowed to weld a gearbox mount. The real story is about who controls the narrative around an expensive object